Hey everyone, I'm here with David Grann, author of Killers of the Flower Moon, a New York Times bestseller. And boy, is this interesting. This is part of the reason that this is such an interesting book is because it's actually multiple tales in one. It's a murder mystery, a true crime murder mystery about the Osage Nation in Oklahoma, Native Americans, and suddenly a number of them are being killed. 24 of them are being killed. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in the 1920s, the Osage Indians, there were about 2,000 or so of them in northeast Oklahoma, had become the wealthiest people per capita in the world because of oil under their land. It was said at the time, whereas one American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them. In 1923, those 2,000 or so Osage received what would be worth today more than $400 million. And then they began to die under very mysterious and sinister circumstances. I write about one woman, Molly Burkhart, who watches as one sister disappears and is found shot in the back of the head. She has a younger sister who is blown up in her house. And one by one, the Osage are being killed through. There's shootings, there's poisonings. Right. And the death toll, eventually, official death toll climbed to more than 24. And that's when eventually the FBI entered the case.
Right, and that is sort of the second tale here. But I should say with the Osage Indians, what's sort of fascinating about their journey is, I mean, it's part of American history, the mistreatment of Native Americans here. They are pushed off of their land and pushed and pushed and pushed. And then they sort of just decide, you know what, we're going to settle on this rock. Yes. There's nothing there. You can't grow anything. Yes. And they think, we will settle here because the white man won't come after us here. They won't want what's here. Yes. And what ends up being there is a whole lot of oil, which is what makes them very, very rich.
That's exactly right. They want to control much of the central part of the country, all the way from the edge of Kansas to the edge of the Rockies. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson referred to them as the Great Nation. And then slowly they were driven off their land. They were forced to cede 100 million acres of their land. And then in the 1870s, they were driven off again off their land in Kansas. And that's when this Osage chief stood up, and there's still a record of what he said. And he said, our people should move to this land. It was then Indian territory. It would later become part of Oklahoma because the land is rocky, it's infertile, essentially it's worthless, and the white man won't want it. And so eventually they'll leave us alone. And then, of course, lo and behold, it was sitting upon some of the largest deposits of oil then in the United States.
Right, and the opposite happens.
And the opposite.
Everyone flocks to this area.
Including some of the greatest oil barons that we know today. The Getty family first struck oil in the Osage. That's where their money first came from. Harry Sinclair, the Phillips brothers from Conoco, all these, E.W. Marlin. They would actually hold these auctions for leases under this elm tree for land so that they could drill on. And these leases would sell for anywhere between as much as $2 million. And the elm tree became known as the $1 million elm.
And you mentioned, you know, the Osage became incredibly wealthy, and much to the despair, chagrin of some, so wealthy that they were able to even hire white servants in their house. So this is like unheard of.
Well,
right?
It belied long-standing stereotypes of Native Americans that traced all the way back to the original contact and the brutal first contact, and really the original sin from which the country was born. And not only did it provoke strange reactions, the U.S. Congress went so far as to pass legislation requiring that many Osage have white guardians to manage their fortune.
Right.
So here you could be this great Osage chief leading your nation, have millions in your trust, and you had a white person telling you whether you could get this toothpaste at the corner store or this car. And not only was this system deeply racist, I mean, it was literally based on the quantum of Osage blood, whether you had a guardian. It also led to an enormous criminal enterprise, as many guardians swindled millions and millions of dollars from the Osage.
So there you have the backdrop. And then story number 2 is what I felt was sort of the coming of age of the FBI. That there, in terms of federal law enforcement, there really wasn't anything. The country had rejected the concept of federal law enforcement for years, right? I don't want the government coming in and telling me what to do. So you had this sort of ragtag law enforcement. And so at this point, under, of all people, Hoover, the FBI is becoming professional.
Yes. Yes. What's really interesting about this time is it really reflects the birth of the FBI, the birth of modernization, and really the birth of a modern country. By 1923, after so many Osage had been killed, many law enforcement who tried to catch the killers locally, some of them were killed, and also there was deep, widespread corruption among law enforcement back then locally. It was still a very lawless country.
Mm-hmm.
If you were powerful, you could tip the scales of justice. So in 1923, the Osage issued a tribal resolution asking for federal authorities to step in. And the case went to the FBI. Now, it was still a fledgling organization. It was a very ragtag organization at the time, had just a smattering of offices across the country. Agents were still not allowed to make arrests. They actually had to get local authorities to do it. They weren't authorized to carry guns. And so this is a period when the Bureau is trying to modernize.
They've got new technology like fingerprint technology, right?
Handwriting analysis,
right.
fingerprinting. And so what's so amazing is they bring in, but they were in this transitional period, and they eventually bring in, which is this part of the second story, this field agent, a guy named Tom White, who came of age at a time when law was kind of practiced out by the smoking barrel of a gun.
Yeah.
And now he shows up in Washington, wearing a suit, having to use fingerprints, has to file paperwork, which he can't stand. He's becoming part of a larger bureaucratic organization. And he's asked to take over the case. Now, the Bureau, up until that point, had really messed up the case. And they had even got an outlaw out of jail, hoped to use him as an informant. Instead, he robbed a bank and killed a police officer. So Hoover, who was new in his job, he was only 29, is worried about this scandal. And so he turns to White to hopefully save the case. And White puts together this undercover team.
And I can't even believe that this guy existed, the FBI agent White, because he's almost perfect. Like you said, he sort of comes up in a law and order type of family that's used to sort of a Wild West environment, but he's interested in this more professional, more systematic version of law enforcement and crime investigation.
Yes. He what he does is he puts together an undercover team.
Yeah.
He knows about the danger, and he tries ultimately to remove the corruption that had been so pervasive in so many of these cases. And he has these recruits, and they go in undercover. One goes in as an insurance salesman. I thought most interestingly enough, he has a Native American agent who is part of the undercover team, and there are no statistics, but I think it's fair to say that he was the only American Indian in Hoover's bureau at the time, given Hoover's prejudice. And they go in undercover, and they try to follow the money. And it ultimately...
Don't give away too much.
All right.
Because it's you think you know it,
Yes.
and then it just becomes so much bigger than that. But this area of Oklahoma is just out of control.
Yes.
There's almost no law. I mean, every witness that they try to run down has been killed or is already in jail for something else.
Yeah, there was a man who, one lawyer is thrown off a speeding train. There's a man who goes to Washington, D.C. This was before 1923, hoping to get the federal authorities to investigate. He checks into a boarding house. He's carrying a Bible and a pistol. He receives a message from a colleague, an associate in Oklahoma. It says, "Be careful." He checks out. He leaves the boarding house that evening. He is abducted. At some point, a sack is placed over his head. He is found the next day in a culvert. He was beaten to death and stabbed more than 20 times.
Right.
And it was then that the Washington Post had a headline that said, "Conspiracy to kill the rich Osage."
Right. When I was reading this, I thought, how on earth did you do the research? Because it's clear that, the Osage are kind of seen as sort of half men. They're not full citizens in a way. And I thought there couldn't be a lot of documentation about their movements. And how did you do your research?
Yeah, I did two things. One was just spending, for me, it was incredibly important. I begin the book through the story of Molly Burkhart, who, just like Tom White, she's an amazing woman. She was someone who was born in a wigwam in the 1880s, which is essentially, it's like a teepee wigwam, speaking Osage, practicing Osage traditions. Within a few years, the U.S. government forces her to go to a boarding school across as far as she's ever been from her home. She has to remove her Osage blanket. She's no longer allowed to speak her language. She has to capture the white man's tongue. And then within a few decades, because of oil money, she's married to a white settler. She's living in a mansion. She speaks English. she straddles not only 2 centuries, but 2 civilizations. In official accounts, her perspective was negated. It did not exist.
She's a woman, she's native.
She's Osage, she's a
Yeah.
woman. And so for me, as best I could, I wanted to try, based on the records, it's all true, so I'm limited by what I can find to find that. So I went through Osage archives. I tracked down Osage descendants. One of the most powerful experiences I had was tracking down the descendants of the killers and of the victims, many of whom live in the same neighborhoods today in Oklahoma. And that's still part of the story of America and why this story is important. And one of the people I tracked down was Molly's granddaughter, a lovely woman named Margie Burkhart. And she gave me great insights into Molly, into the family. She took me out to the graveyard where so many of her ancestors were buried who were killed. And when you walk through that graveyard and you look at the dates, you start to realize that this was a Holocaust in many ways. And speaking to Margie, you get a sense of how this is still living history. This was not that long ago.
Yeah.
It still reverberates today.
Yeah, but this would have, because the whole idea was to, this is not giving away too much, the whole idea was to steal the wealth underneath the ground, the land rights, right, from the Osage. This would have changed the trajectory of these two families. You know, when you talk about sort of old money, this is about taking away that money. But these relatives are still living with each other.
Yes.
I mean, do they get along? Or do they?
I spoke to an Osage elder named Mary Jo Webb toward the end of the book, and one of the things she told me is that, you know, we have descendants just living down the street. She said in some cases they don't know, you know, what their ancestors did, or they don't want to know. And I thought with great understanding and forgiveness, she said, but we don't hold them responsible for the blood of their forebears. And I thought that showed kind of remarkable. And I did an event which was really interesting in Tulsa, where I had there were descendants of many of the victims were there, many of them, including Margie. And there was a descendant of one of the masterminds, one of the killers. And at a certain point, she revealed who she was. And her and Margie actually came over at a certain point and embraced. And so there, again, you see this history still playing out today.
Yeah. How could something like this, and I know it was covered in the media, but I had never heard of the story before your book. How could something like this go unnoticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sadly, you know, partly why so many of the murder victims were ignored was because they were Native Americans. Many of these cases went unsolved. And one of the really important elements of the book I try to show in the last section is that there's even a much deeper and darker conspiracy that the Bureau never exposed. And that kind of has languished and not become
beyond this crime.
Yes, beyond that. It was far more widespread. And there's a much deeper conspiracy. And I think these stories got marginalized, sadly. And I think one of the great things about this today, about Amazon choosing this book, is that this story is becoming part of our conscience. And I think that is where it belongs. It's really a part of our history. And I don't think you can understand our history unless you understand stories like this.
So true. Why is it called Killers of the Flower Moon?
So the Osage name traditionally have a name for each month that's named after a moon. And the month of May is known as the Little Flower Killing Moon because all these beautiful flowers spread across the prairie. They're these beautiful bluets. They look almost like confetti. And then the larger plants come and steal their water and steal their light, and those beautiful flowers die out. And the first murder, the disappearance of Molly's sister, Anna Brown, takes place in the month of May.
Oh, that's good imagery. Because I hadn't gotten to that part of the book. I don't know if it's in the book or not. Your last book, The Lost City of Z, takes place in 1920s.
Yes.
This also takes place in 1920s. Do you like that era?
You know, it's an interesting era. It's about really the transformation of the country, and The Lost City of Z about this explorer. It's really the beginning of the end of that kind of old exploration. These people kind of ventured in. He ventured into the Amazon. They disappeared. These people would venture into unknown places with a machete and a compass and almost a divine sense of purpose.
Yeah.
That era was ending.
Yeah, and all the characters are quite fascinating. They are rough around the edges. sort of venturing into becoming polished.
Yes.
Like I said before, it's almost hard to believe that they're real life people.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, as you were reading about them, were you starting to? It seems like for the FBI agent Tom White, it seems like you personally really like him.
I did.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny, but as a reporter, you are always looking for skeletons. I mean, it's what we do. And he's interesting. He was hard to write about in some ways because, and Molly too, there's a quiet goodness about them. They are, there's a quiet goodness about them and the way they behave and the way they act and almost a quiet courage. So capturing that is difficult, but they both had it and it was both really remarkable. And thankfully, they were two wonderful people to spend time with because the book has a lot of evil, more evil than I've ever written about, but it also has a lot of goodness. This is a real story about good and evil.
You said it was wonderful to spend time with them. Are they alive for you?
Well, they are. I spent almost 5 years working on this book. So yes, you really come to spend time with them, with their diaries, their letters, their photographs. And over the years, they kind of occupy. You spend more time with them than I did with all my, my friends. Other than my wife and children, I spend more time with them than anybody else.
Right. And this bit about evil, because I found myself gasping over and over again. I cannot believe sort of the inhumanity.
Huh.
But I suppose that is what this country is made of, right? I mean, it's hard to sort of carve out a brand new country out of the wilderness. So it takes some tough people.
Yes. And two things came together to create these crimes: greed and prejudice. Mm-hmm. And when people ask what were the Osage killed, they were killed for their money. I mean, they were killed for their money. We're not talking about robbing a bank. We're talking about from the oil money, millions and millions that kept flowing in regularly every four months. You would get another check. But prejudice made these killings widespread. Mm-hmm. It made one of the killers ultimately in one of his confessions says, killing in Osage today is no different than killing an American Indian in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to see if there's any sort of questions here that people are asking you about.
Yes.
What era?
What era? Yeah, we talked a little bit about the era. What era it is? It's the 1920s.
Yes.
Sort of the maybe the late 1800s into the 1920s.
Yes,
right?
yes. And you really get a sense. It's such an interesting time in this country because the story tracks the evolution of law enforcement because you're seeing the modernization, but you're also seeing the birth of a country.
Somebody's asking me to hold this up.
Okay.
You are seeing the birth of a country, and birth can be ugly,
yes.
right? We all know that birth can be ugly.
Yes.
What do you hope that people get out of this?
I hope that stories like this are such an important part of our history. We can't understand our history unless we reckon with its past. It's a difficult past, but we need to reckon with it in order to understand it. And for example, if you're following what's happening today in Washington with the FBI and Comey, you need to understand this early part of this history. If you're following what's happening with Standing Rock, you need to understand this part of our history. Otherwise, these things happen out of context. You need to understand these underpinnings that still play out today.
I think that is a great point, David. I think that one of the things I love about this is the fact that it is historical, and so you're sort of getting your vegetables wrapped in a coating of mystery and murder, a coating of candy, but your vegetables are underneath. It's a fantastic book. Killers of the Flower Moon. David Grann, thank you so much.
Thank you.
They said hold it up, so I'm holding it up.